huge welcome to the fourth Raspberry Pi research community education research seminar, which is great, and really pleased to see all of you here. So the title of this seminar is Unplugged Computing and Semantic Waves. Really pleased to have Jane come along. I've known Jane for several years. Currently she's doing a PhD in primary and design in primary programming. Previously, she worked with me at King's College London, doing a fantastic job in supporting teachers in computing teachers in London. She's also got decades of experience in, I might make her sound too old, but lots of experience in primary teaching and in industry, and is a very well-known expert in this country, at least, around primary computing. So I'm really pleased that she's wants to talk to us about semantic waves and unplugged computing. And Jane, without embarrassing you any further, I think I'll hand over to you. You right to share your screen?
So thank you ever so much for inviting me to talk today, and I am really excited to talk about unplugged computing and semantic waves. Semantic waves is not my main area of study, but it's something that I've started to become more and more involved with, but it's not my original research, so that will become, in terms of the underlying theory, but that will become apparent as I start to move through the slides. So first of all, I have to say thank you to the Institute of Coding, because they actually paid for this particular paper, which we published last year, to be available to everybody. So thank you to the Institute of Coding for paying for that license. And it's written by myself and Paul Curzon, who is my professor at Queen Mary University of London, and also by Carl Maton, who is at Sydney University, and Lucinda, who's part of the Barefoot team, and that'll all become kind of apparent as we start to move through. So the aim of this piece of research was to explore the use of semantic waves as a better way to understand unplug computing activities. So it's this idea of two particular areas of interest kind of coming together. And then the rationale for that was, we've really got limited research, I think particularly in primary, in terms of teaching how we should teach computing in schools, so around the pedagogy. But unplugged computing, or unplugged approach, seems to be really popular. And in fact, Sue did a little bit of research, which was going back a little while ago, but 2016, looking at the different approaches that teachers were using, and unplugged kind of featured quite heavily. And I think that's been seen in other studies as well. But the actual research on unplugged activities itself, despite it being popular, is very mixed. So there is some research that says, yes, it definitely has an impact on outcomes. Then there's other research that said, nope, it doesn't. And then there's some that is kind of mixed and says, well, maybe it does if you can tailor it to the particular situation. But perhaps one of the reasons for this diverse view of kind of opinions about unplugged is, what on earth is unplugged? And there are lots of different approaches, from analogies through to role play and then storytelling. And then there are different ways to deliver it. So of course, CS Unplugged and Tim Bell's work, then often you'll see whole class activities using role play to explain concepts such as, say, binary. But then you've got, say, Paul Curzon's work in terms of, say, the work that he does around magic and storytelling, which are kind of to audiences in very large lectures, which are explaining things, but then with individuals getting involved to do role play again. Then Barefoot kind of resources, which I was very lucky to be involved with, we have whole class activities, but then we have paired activities and individual activities. And again, there's a whole range of different approaches and delivery mechanisms. And I think I noticed Cynthia was in the audience, and sorry, Celia was in the audience from Scratch Maths, and there are lots again of unplugged activities that can be seen within some of the resources there. So the unplugged is out there, but in terms of how effective it is, that we need some more robust kind of research. some of the reasons that have been put forward for it working are around the physical enactment that goes on, and the fact that that makes these often very abstract concepts memorable and concrete. And Paul Curzon, the year before last, he kind of wrote and said maybe it's because of this continual movement between concrete and abstract activities as well as simple and complex contexts, and that then fed into this kind of idea, or it started to get us thinking about, or to get Paul thinking about, the work by Carl Maton on knowledge building in this area called semantic waves. So that's kind of the background and the journey. But I've talked about Unplugged, but I've not talked about what semantic waves is. So semantic waves was created by Carl Maton, and it builds on the work of Bernstein and Bordeaux, and I am not an expert in this area, so please don't ask me any complicated questions, but I can point you towards the people who do. The theory is called legitimation code theory, and the LCT group, who kind of are really into all of this, they've got an amazing community, very active community that you can get involved with. And the whole idea of LCT, there are a number of different dimensions, of which semantic waves or semantics is just one part, is looking around what constitutes a good learning experience. And I've seen it applied in such a wide range of scenarios, from teaching ballet to midwifery, law. It's almost like every time I look on their website, there's another area that it's been applied to. But we think that, apart from Dorian Love, who did some work on ICT, we think we were the first with this paper to look at computer science, applying it to computer science. So that's why it was exciting. So semantics, as I said, is one dimension of LCT. And the idea of it is that you can use it to analyze the changes in a learning activity over time. And it has two elements. So the first is density, and I always kind of make a little fist when I talk about semantic density to remind myself what it's about. And it's about the complexity of meaning. It's how much information or knowledge you pack into the terms that you are using. So that, and I'm going to have a cat up here. Go on, cat. So if you were talking about cats, because there's a cat, and you had a very strong density, then you would use very technical terms that perhaps only a vet would understand. But if you had a weak semantic density, then you'd use everyday words like, oh, it's a cat. The second aspect of semantic waves is gravity. So the idea of gravity, it's all about context. So you might talk about cats just generally, about the general feline experience, but you might talk about my cat specifically, and the fact that it's just jumped up onto my desk. So that would have a strong gravity because it's about my particular cat in this particular situation rather than cats in general. So that was a bit off the cuff. In order to explain a little bit more about semantic waves and semantic profiles, what you do is you draw a semantic profile. So it's a way to express density and gravity by drawing something. And at the top of the graph, where it's got weak gravity and strong density, what that's meaning is, if it's weak gravity, it's this idea, I'm just talking generally about cats. It's not a specific cat. It's not specifically on my desk. It's just it's in an abstract, non-contextualized situation, but I might be using very technical vocabulary. So it's got strong density. There's lots of words that might be kind of used to talk about that particular concept. And at the bottom of the graph, we have, if your line is at the bottom of the graph, then you have strong gravity and weak density. So what that would mean, it's in a specific context and using everyday language. So the top of the graph is the kind of place that you might have a very theoretical discussion at universities. And then the bottom of the graph, if you see the line, then it's an everyday experience that is familiar, using everyday language and specific. So if we were to draw a learning experience, it might start at the top saying we're going to learn about some particular technical concept in an abstract way, and then you might start to unpack that particular concept by explaining things using a concrete example, a concrete context, and simple and everyday language. Then you might do an activity at the bottom. That's where an unplugged activity might come in, where you've got something with diagrams, examples, and metaphors, which again is specific context, everyday language. And then you might repack or link back that everyday example experience to the more technical, abstract description that uses technical vocabulary. So we have to put those two terms into our head, density and then gravity. So why did we kind of think, or why do you wave? So the theory is that if you have a flat line, so say if I have a flat line at the top of the graph, then that would just be lots of theory and lots of technical words, a little bit like me sitting in a stats kind of lecture where I have no idea what people are talking about, and that there's no wave. Or you might have a flat line at the bottom of the graph where, say, children are learning about algorithms, but there's never any link back to what an algorithm is in a more abstract kind of way of looking at it. So there's this idea that you need to wave, or that's what Maton is suggesting, is that you need to wave in order to link the theory and the abstract concepts to the practical everyday experiences. And it's this idea that you don't have a single wave, that you have waves within waves and accumulative waves. And this is starting to feed into teacher training, curriculum planning, and classroom practice. So what was the method that we used? So we just did a case study. So I basically online discussed with Carl Maton a particular learning activity, and in detail we profiled it. So we drew that graph, and this is an approach that seems to be quite popular in the LCT community. It's a way that people are describing and comparing different learning experiences. And the project that we took to wave, or to draw, was Crazy Characters, which I was very familiar with because I wrote it, and in fact I used to teach it in my class probably about 6-7 years ago, before I wrote it up for Barefoot, and it was at the time of 2017 the most popular Barefoot resource. So it seemed like a good example to use because people would be familiar with it. This is a semantic profile, so I am going to go through this with you. I had no idea when we started whether there would be a wave. I didn't know if it would be flat line at the top, flat line at the bottom, but it had this kind of shape. So that in itself was really interesting for me. And I'm going to kind of call it A, B, C, D. I'm going to name the stages as we go through them. So at the beginning of the lesson plan, the teacher just says, we're going to learn about something new today. You just need to listen out. Now, at that point, when I wrote that back in 2014 for Barefoot, I didn't know that I was signaling. So at that point, I'm kind of starting to, as I draw the semantic profile, as I draw the shape, then I'm starting to move upwards because I'm kind of getting the children ready. There's going to be something new and technical coming along. Then I share the learning intention. At that point, I'm just talking about algorithms. Just say we're going to learn about algorithms. There's no context. The theory is it's a brand new term they've never heard of. So we're very high in terms of the profile. So what that means is that the density is very high and the gravity is very weak. Then I do something, or I realise, or this is what Carl Maton said to me. He said, I now bungee jump, because what I do is I say, or the instructions to the teacher are to say they're going to use an algorithm now. And at that point, I'm linking, but in quite a coarse way, the top of the wave to the bottom of the wave, but at least there's some kind of connection. And then the next kind of 10-15 minutes is the teacher reading out some steps, some instructions to draw a crazy character, and the children kind of follow, and they kind of, I give them more and more detail, and that's the concrete activity. This is a context. I don't use the word algorithm, or the teacher's not advised to use the word algorithm at that point, and the children are just doing some kind of practical experience. But then I start to draw them back up the wave, and again I didn't quite realize that that's what I was doing. But I asked children, or the teachers instructed to ask their children to show what they've done, and then of course is surprised, incredibly surprised, that they've all drawn completely different things. And it was interesting how Carl Maton described that. He talked about counter expectancy and the fact that different options are being introduced, and so there's a degree of inquiry that's kind of going on in the child's mind, perhaps in that there's more to it, to this kind of set of instructions and what we're learning about. And then we get this stage return of, I start to ask how they could change it, or the teacher's instructed to ask how the children could change it. And we're starting now to decrease the density, because it's just questions like, how could you make those instructions better? So it's not, and it's in general, how in general could you improve your instructions? So we're moving away from it just being about drawing that crazy character. And then we ask them to give a general definition about what they think an algorithm is. And at that point, we've really kind of got the punch in there, in that now we've got this dense bit of vocabulary again, and we're being very generic, so the context is open, so the gravity is weak. Now, that's the theory. So that's what's in my head as the author of that resource and the person who originally used to kind of deliver it. But the question is, I suppose, would all teachers deliver it in the same way? So let's kind of look. I have got some kind of wave, but let's kind of think about it in general. So what semantic profiling did for me was it gave me a language and a method to analyse my lesson plan in detail with Carl Maton. And since then, I've been able to discuss that lesson plan with other teachers, and we're kind of using it kind of more widely as well to help teachers talk about and compare lesson planning activities. And the suspicion is that perhaps it is a practical and useful way that we could analyse activities in CS education. And I suppose that's a question to you. Do you think it's a useful kind of approach? However, and this is the thing that really struck me, was every student's experience in my class of that lesson would be different. There would be children who at the end would have kind of lost interest by that point in time and would be thinking about playtime. So the repacking would just not have happened. And there could be other children who would kind of come into the class who already have got a good view of what an algorithm is. So they're kind of what they're doing as they go through that experience, they're maybe already using the word algorithm to their peers. And also, I know this for sure, that different teachers, they implement this in different ways. And there's some quite nice research by this is Tim Bell, and I think it's his PhD student, Michael Loddy, I'm not sure, who very recently wrote about the fact that in their CS Unplugged activities, they were very aware, they become very aware that often teachers don't quite know what the key points are in the lesson plan that they must not miss out. And they didn't talk about semantic waves, they were just talking generally about the fact that teachers don't always know what the key features are. But by me drawing the wave, I now know where my key features are. They're on the drop at the beginning and then on the pack at the end. So I think there's lots of opportunity for us to talk about kind of what semantic waves can bring to us. But the case study suggests that perhaps the way that I happened to have designed the lesson, maybe this linking of concept to practical activities then back up again, maybe that's part of the reason why it's very popular and seen as being effective. On the other hand, it might be just that it's fun. But computer science is it's such an abstract kind of it's just packed with abstract ideas and concepts and heavy vocabulary. Then yet we're expected for 5-year-olds to 7-year-olds to know what an algorithm is. So maybe semantic profiling has got this power to help us review and understand what we're doing because of this whole thing of vocabulary, and also because teachers do seem to be doing these unplugged and quite practical activities that then drop into everyday language, that maybe we can start to use semantic profiling to look at both just CS concept delivery in general, but actually perhaps particularly with unplugged activities. But we know that we need to do more. In fact, we've just sent off, hot off the press, another 3 case studies for, fingers crossed, for publication. We'll see if we get in. So we're kind of doing more profiling of more activities, but we also know we need to do chains of activities. So what the impact is of having, one wave after another, and also different shapes. Doesn't have to be a wave. It can be kind of just curves down, lots of curves down, many different ways to do it. But we need to compare profiles of what are seen to be successful and less successful lessons. And also to look at combinations. I think we're all very interested, a lot in my area, we're interested in this idea of, if we do an unplugged activity before we do a plugged activity, is that better than not at all? Or, what is the benefit of unplugged and plugged, and how close do they need to be, and those kind of things. But at least now we can start to articulate that in a way that we can maybe share. And we wrote this back in 2019, and since then there's almost been an explosion of semantic wave interest, and there's a quick read on the Raspberry Pi resources. I wrote about it for Hello World. We've been doing CPD about it, so there's a lot of interest now, but we need to think, maybe take a step back and say, is it useful? So I'd really like to hear everybody's thoughts, and I think I've finished. Oh, and you can find out lots more. As I said, the LGCT community are really lovely, and they're really keen to have lots of people get involved. I know they'd really like to hear from us, as a community as well. So I'm done.
That's great. Thank you, Jane. And first speaker to finish completely on time. So that's not overrun, I mean. So that's brilliant. So we've got lots of time to have a good discussion. And you did say, when I asked you earlier, that we can discuss generally, but you said you might have some questions for people to think about in the breakout groups.
Yeah, I think do we think it's useful, really? And also because it is a case study approach. It's up to now, we've not done anything that is longitudinal, is it robust? And we haven't really got to a situation yet where we've asked person A to profile and then person B to profile and see if we get the same profiles. So I think there's lots still to be done to make it a more robust methodology. So maybe something about robust methodology and something about, do we think it's useful?
And also something about unplugged activities.
Yeah, unplugged. Is it worth doing it?
Yeah. Okay, so that's lots of things for everyone to talk about. So we're now moving into the phase of the seminar when we go into smaller groups, and we've got lots of things to think about. As if you've been on one of these sessions before, we invite you to use the whiteboard in your groups to record your notes. If you haven't done that before, there's a green button at the bottom. You go to share screen and a whiteboard appears. So you need to ask somebody, decide in your group who's going to look after the whiteboard, and they need to save it before the end of the session so that they don't lose all their notes. Also, we typically have people from all over the world come to these sessions, so not everyone knows everybody else. So please do in your groups introduce yourselves to each other before you start chatting, and then Diana will give you the nod or some technological nod to come back to the main session for Q&A. For the Q&A, either could you just pop your hand up using the reactions tab, or either of those yellow hands is fine, to ask a question, or signal in the chat somehow that you'd like to ask a question. Either write the question, then I can ask you. So who'd like to ask Jane a nice, meaty, difficult, challenging question on her talk? Anyone? I can't see any yellow hands up. Oh, Catherine, thank you.
Yeah, so we had a really good chat in our group. Very, very interesting. One of the things we were particularly discussing is how unplugged activities would then blend with plugged activities. And so, for example, the crazy characters activity is very, very unplugged. But there are some learnings that you could take back into using this sort of in Scratch, for example, in terms of drawing shapes and things. And that seems to be sort of part of the repacking sort of part of the semantic wave. But yeah, just interested in your thoughts on how you would move from unplugged activities and blend them into plugged activities again then, Jane.
I don't know.
See, I told you we'd start with a meaty question.
I think when I wrote, what's really interesting is that when I wrote the Barefoot activities, we were writing things that were unplugged, and we were not thinking about how, and this, I think this is a mistake, you know, hand on heart. I don't think we were thinking then how would that blend into the next, or how that would accumulate, because we were kind of just doing one-off activities, which more than anything were for the teacher to start to understand what the concepts were. So yeah, they were for the children, but they were also really supposed to be big CPD events for the teachers. And then theoretically, the teacher might take that knowledge of what an algorithm is and then maybe create their own unplugged activity, which maybe was more part of the plugged context. So I'm not convinced that crazy characters is a good example in terms of them blending, because I actually tried to create a plugged activity that ran on from it, and it was really difficult to do because it is such an ambiguous, and therefore not really an algorithm, an ambiguous activity in terms of instructions. But what you've done there in terms of giving your example where you said, well, why not do an unplugged activity where you're drawing shapes, because shapes then becomes the same context. So maybe it's about saving the context, so the context is the same but applied in a different media. So maybe that's a better way to do it. I don't know, you know, really, I don't know.
It's also, I mean, some of the criticisms of Unplugged when we were doing lots and lots of it became really popular, was that you do lots of nice activities and then children wouldn't know that was actually computer science or computing at all. So by linking it back to something you did on the computer and linking it back to a programming activity or something, then you could make the connection. The repacking could take place by by going from unplugged to plugged.
Yeah, I think there's got to be something that's common, isn't it? It's either got to be the vocabulary that you use, that now we're using an algorithm. And do you remember how we use that algorithm to do that? So that there's a concept is the same or the context is the same. So maybe, I don't know, maybe then it's about keeping the same density concept or keeping the same context for your gravity. Whoa, but I just made that up.
Anyway, let's we go to the next question. So my next question is from Brian. Had your hand up? I think you've written. Do you want to welcome from the US?
Thank you. Lovely to be here. I'm curious if the wave pattern shown for this lesson is typical and or recommended, and if that varies across subject areas or for purpose, and when, if ever, there should be smaller interim wave patterns.
And do you know what, Brian? I'm going to say I don't know again. And in fact, I think Dorian, who is way more a semantic wave expert, is actually in the session today. And he's actually just put in the chat, I don't think there is a correct wave at all. And I think it's just about movement. And I agree with him. I think it is about connecting. It's about that connection. And that's why we need to do more research. So we need to research whether, you know, starting at the bottom, connecting to the top, you know, lots of little waves within waves. The honest truth is I don't know, because I don't have evidence. All that I've done is we've managed to evidence that we can draw something, and it seems to provoke discussion, and we're starting to get to a point where we are changing lesson planning activities in order to often add in repacking, because that's the thing we often forget to, finding ourselves we're forgetting to do. But now we need to compare the learner's experience to say, well, you know, with a repack, do you know more when you do your next activity? Or So I don't know. Brian, good question.
Yeah. So we just move on to another question then. So I've got some in the chat. So Becky, do you want to give your question and then we'll do Cherie? Becky, where?
Yeah, hi, sorry. And find the right button. So one of the things we talked about is remote learning and how to deal with remote learning and unplugged activities and going from plugged, unplugged to back to plugged again. And you don't necessarily have the luxury of time or breakout sessions or even the vocabulary of the student to be able to handle these kinds of activities.
Okay, so the only way that I can kind of answer this is in terms of experience that I've had. So we've recently finished, or just about to finish, doing a course teaching adults, so that's teaching teachers, games development using a particular programming language. And we actually put into the CPD we added repacking. And this was obviously all done online. And the way that we added the repacking was, so this is programming, so it's not answering your question about Unplugged, but I'll try and draw an analogy with it, was that we had Google Docs and the teachers at the end of each conceptual kind of wave, rather than leaving them at the bottom where they'd done an activity, we actually got them to go into the Google Doc and to summarize what they'd just learned about that particular concept. So we found a method by which in an online environment, we could get adults to record make them repack. First of all, they didn't like doing it, which of course was interesting. But if you were doing an unplugged activity, and in fact, I can give you another example. So Paul Curzon has been running online webinars where people have been doing unplugged activities with pieces of paper. So he did a teleporting robot where you move bits of paper around, and he had people could either print out bits of paper, or we had an online version where they did it. And again, what he did, he designed, and in fact that's what we've written up for our next paper, is he's designed his activities so that he introduces the concept, he does some unpacking, everybody does some activities, and then he gets everyone to repack. So I think you can do it. Whether we have not, though. I have not yet been in a session, have I? No, haven't yet been in a session where we've done an unplugged online and a plugged online. So I've done an unplugged online separately, and I've done a plugged online separately, but I haven't joined the two up. But we've found methods, particularly using Google Docs actually, or other shared written media to get learners to repack. It's completely different if you've got a bunch of 5-year-olds because they can't all sit and type. They'd kind of riot, wouldn't they? So I don't know if that helped. Did that help at all, Becky? Did it?
Yes, it did. It helped get going. So thank you.
Yeah. Good. And I think we're moving to the next question from Shri. Do you want to ask that question?
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, Jane.
Hi.
My question is, I teach maths and general computing techniques also to secondary school students and beyond higher secondary levels also. So can we apply similar techniques for teaching abstract concepts in maths and for general computing? That is one question. And related to this, I have some students who are actually specially challenged, and even one among them has a borderline IQ. So do you think, can I apply these techniques, or will it not work in those cases?
You're bound to know that I'm going to say I don't know because I don't have evidence. But there's certainly the LCT community, and again, Dorian's more of an expert in this than I am. It's not just about computer science, it's any subject. And it doesn't have to be an unplugged activity at the bottom. It can be just that you put it into context so that if you're describing an abstract a mathematical concept, so I'm going to think about J numbers, because I think that's the most abstract thing I've ever heard of that I remember from school, that you would talk about J numbers, but then you'd have to somehow find an analogy. So the analogy is what's down the bottom, so that you can talk about, you know, this extra dimension and Doctor Who or whatever. So, and then you get them to repack. So from a personal view, I think it doesn't matter what the subject is, but again, Carl Maton could say that maybe it's suited more to one or the other. The question about special educational needs, I think Catherine Elliott might be here, and Catherine, I'm sure I just saw something from Catherine Elliott. Yeah, so Catherine is the queen of special educational needs and has been talking to me, and I put her in touch with somebody about special educational needs and semantic profiling, and we talked about this in our group. I think there's huge opportunities for us to consider individual children's experiences of the wave or not the wave or whatever the shape is. And so yeah, I think that there are huge opportunities there, but Catherine, I don't know if she's managed to talk to anybody yet about that. So
not yet, I'm talking to them soon, but I mean, my gut feeling is it's incredibly useful. It's just the repacking, I think, is going to be the really tricky part to actually make those connections and how you make that stick. But yeah, I will let people know when we find out.
So I think the one I'm particularly interested in, that maybe there's two routes to repack, that you can either keep the context and start to introduce more technical vocabulary, or you can use everyday language but lose the context. So in other words, you can still try, and I think maybe that's what we need to explore, is which way for novices and maybe people of different, I don't know, I feel like there's something about the different routes that of which you change the density or the gravity going back. But Carl Maton said I've got to think about it more carefully. So okay.
I think that's a really good point, because you talk about the density going down and the gravity going up and vice versa, but actually it's more 3D if you look at them as independent. If you look at them independently,
yeah,
that's what's kind of puzzled me about the wave.
Yeah, it is so simplified because you're assuming that you're keeping the same so that they're going together, but they don't. And you can, when I was actually drawing the wave with Carl, I would say, well, you know, what I'm mainly doing here is it's all about the context. And then I go, but now I've stopped using the technical vocabulary. And it is, when do you put when do you swap the vocabulary and when do you drop the context? And maybe some kids that it's really hard to kind of change both, and that you have to do another wave in order to then move them up again with both of the things. But maybe Dorian again knows more than I do.
Great. We've only got time. I think we've got time for one more question, because I've got other questions, but I wanted to give Yorgos an opportunity to ask this question, which is about whether it's just for concepts. I can't see Yorgos on my screen. George.
Yes, I'm now, I think.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hi. Jane, thank you very much. Semantic Web is about teaching concepts, I think. What about computational thinking and problem solving? Have you thought of it?
Well, in a sense, that's exactly what we were teaching, because we were teaching about algorithms. So if you think, well, it all depends what you mean by computational thinking, of course. But if you consider that algorithms and algorithmic thinking is part of computational thinking, then that's what the semantic wave was about. And when Carl Maton talks about it, he doesn't talk about concepts. He talks just about knowledge. Now, whether you can do the same thing for skills. So, you know, if I'm good at horse riding, then is that a skill or is that knowledge? I don't know. Maybe that's the whole point, that it's that combination of knowing about the concepts related to any skill. Oh, gosh, sounds like a competency-based framework there. So I think we have already got into computational thinking if you include algorithms, but I completely agree with you, that whole thing of
because computational thinking is not about only concept, it's about skills also, I think. Do you agree or not?
and I suppose that's what the wave is doing, that when you're at the top of the wave, you can be thinking about the concept, but then as you go to the bottom, then the kids are actually they're undertaking the activity of applying algorithmic thinking because they're actually following the instructions. So but again, I think whether that's another dimension, I don't know, but I think there's more that we can do to research that.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think we're coming up close to the hour. I can't say 6 o'clock because it could be anything o'clock for anybody around on the Zoom. But we are coming to the end. So thank you very, very much to Jane for participating. It's been really interesting. There's loads of questions and there's more on the chat that I think we could share with Jane for later. If you want to follow Jane on Twitter, her Twitter handle is now on the screen, and also the RPF seminars hashtag that we use. We have a feedback form which we love you to fill in just after every seminar. We want to know which ones you enjoy and what you get out of it. So we've got a newsletter that we send out with research updates if you'd like to sign up for that. The next seminar we've got is on the 30th of June in a fortnight. We're really pleased. We're going to be having Brianna Morrison to talk about sub-goals and reducing cognitive load in programming. So that's very exciting. Brianna's from Nebraska Omaha University, and we're looking forward to seeing her in 2 weeks. So I think with that, I think we can all say thanks to Jane on the chat and jazz hands or whatever we do at the end. Thank you very much to everybody for coming along again, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Bye.